Doesn't this all look so familiar? And it should, because Dune Imperium UPRISING, the brand new release from Direwolf, is so closely intertwined and related to the original 2020 release of Dune Imperium. I almost see it as if it was the ship of Theseus of board games. Just how much can you replace? How many new components? How many new characters? How many modified cards can you add on before a game becomes something brand new? And this isn't meant to be an insult to Uprising. In fact, Uprising is so closely related, it's even backwards compatible to the original game and its expansions, even though it is an independent sequel to Dune Imperium. The majority of content from both expansions and the previous core game can be incorporated into Uprising. But before I go into the complex relationship between Uprising and its prequel, as well as the two expansions, Immortality and Rise of Ix, I really want to focus in and talk about Uprising's success and why I think it's the stronger of the independent releases. Ultimately, the puzzle that Uprising presents is tenser, more brutal, requires more interactivity, and also is the more rewarding and replayable game. Uprising takes everything the original did well and refines it into a wonderful cacophony of decision making, which represents a brilliant game. Like any tight and stressful game, the tension rises throughout each and every round, and your knives that you receive are blunt and shapeless until you are able to refine your strategy. You create a deck, or you build an army, or you have access to resources that increases your strength as the stakes go ever higher. The race to 10 points is so tense, and each point matters. As you bump up on the influences, you can see other people sweating as they hold the alliance token close to their chest. Intrigue cards are powerful and always are so much fun when someone finally reveals for a huge reverse. Resources are so tight, you always feel hungry. And it's fun and it's brilliant because your creativity goes through by saving cards or buying cards, or what resource you prioritize, or which faction you want to go to. The game provides meaningful decisions. And you always end the game wanting to make changes to your strategy and wanting to improve and refine your own decision makings. And everything I said is perfectly applicable for Dune Imperium as well. But Uprising goes one step further beyond. It's such a finely balanced game with interesting board spaces and fascinating card mechanics that it really just tickles your brain in the right places. You feel like you're making meaningful decisions every turn, and that's because you are. The game rewards creativity, it rewards plans, and it rewards plans within plans. Everything that was a little off, or maybe felt a little unbalanced, or didn't make the most sense has been completely addressed in this game. And I know it's a different puzzle, but puzzles can be improved upon, and I think Dune Imperium Uprising really does improve on that core puzzle. The soul of the games are the same. They share the same love. But Uprising is meaner, it's smarter, it creates complex board states, and swings and meaningful interactions between players that really creates a fun and engaging game throughout in a way that Dune Imperium, the original, just doesn't reach. And ultimately, there's a couple key mechanics that Uprising implements which really elevates an outstanding game like Dune Imperium into one of the best games I've ever played. Dune Imperium Uprising really has 3 new mechanics that really accentuate and increases that decision-making space that a player has. First of which are those spies, these cylinder-looking buddies. Each player is given 3 spies, and you place them on a web of spy outposts that interconnect different spaces together. And this mechanic is truly quite brilliant because whenever you gain the ability to place a spy, it acts as a second layer of worker placement. When someone places down a spy, it allows the ability for them to infiltrate it at a later time and essentially sneak another agent on top, or the ability to gather intelligence by drawing a new card when they reach that space. And this is really an excellent mechanic because it gives foresight to the other players while also providing an advantage to the player who puts down the spy. And Let me give you a quick example. In my own group's meta, the two most in-demand spy places are the Landsrad for the early game and the Space and Guild for the mid and late game. The Landsrad because when someone purchases that Swordmaster the first time for that 8 Solari cost, having a spy ready to go gives them ease of access to purchase it second for that 6 Solari while maintaining turn advantage. On the other hand, the Space and Guild has one of the most powerful combat spaces with the Highliner space, and being able to access that late game gives the massive ability to sway a combat into their favor, even if the space is blocked by another player. These spies really create multiple levels of thought, because once a spy is down, other players have some idea of what the player is thinking. But it also gives that advantage to that player by giving them that future access to either card draw or to be able to infiltrate and use the space. Along with that, because there's only 3 spies, you have to be intelligent on your placement. You want to block other people's spies, but you also want them to be meaningfully useful to yourself. Some characters or cards even have abilities of pulling up spies for certain benefits. Intrigue cards, for example, might give you a huge boost in fighting power if you recall 2 spies, for example. All of this is layered together brilliantly because the puzzle of worker placement is now layered in a way that's creative, thematic, and really creates varied board states that tell a neat story between you and your other players. Players, for example, know that I like putting my spy on the Bene Gesserit spot because the moment someone gets those 4 intrigues, they know I'm coming after them even if they block the secret space. It's fun, it's thematic, and it works very well. Lastly, when it comes to these spies, desperation breeds creative play. And a lot of these cards, the new ones, they have limited faction access, and you'll really feel a lot more restricted on which factions you're able to go through. But cleverly enough, the spies actually act as a medium to get to these factions. Lots of cards have a spy access symbol, which will enable you to reach those spaces a little bit more conveniently as long as you plan ahead. Ultimately, the spies create those juicy board states, those interesting puzzles, and creates an opportunity to plan for the future while slightly revealing your intentions. It's clever and smart and pushes what can be mechanically done. Now, the second major mechanical upgrade is the Choam module. And in the manual, the Choam module is pitched almost as a mini expansion, but truthfully, I would recommend everyone to begin with it. There's no reason not to. And it does solve one of the greatest problems people had with the original Dune Imperium. The Choam module is about variance. You'll notice that the currency to get your engine really moving, Solari, is quite restrictive at the start. And the Choam module gives out Solari, but in a way that requires you to accept a contract, one of these little cardboard tokens. On this token, it's super easy. It says the space you need to go to. Maybe there's a requirement that needs to be met. You need to harvest so much spice in one turn, and in return, you would get some kind of reward. Mostly it's Solari, the money to get that engine going. The reason why this is an important addition is that Dune Imperium, the core game, and even Rise of Ix and Immortality have been somewhat solved in the early game. There's almost a set path of what the optimal play is. And that's really to rush Solari in whatever way possible to get your Swordmaster as quickly as possible for that turn advantage. Now, because the Choam module exists, you're not going to be able to go to the same spaces every single game. You're going to need to modify your strategy. While I still think it's very strong to get Solari as quickly as possible, the method that you need to do so is now different and varied for each game depending on what contracts you receive. Some of these contracts are quite deceptively difficult as well. For example, harvesting 4 spice in a turn, it's quite rare and it's quite hard and almost restrictive to do. On the other hand, easier spaces, easier contracts are often quickly snagged by competing players, so you want to be on top of those to get those contract spaces. At its core, the Choam module and the contract system really try to increase that variance. What might not be an optimal play in one game could quickly become the most cost-effective move in another game, putting you in new situations, which ultimately tickles your dopamine receptors and keeps you engaged game after game. The final mechanical addition is regarding the combat system. Two major additions have been implemented to increase player involvement throughout all the combat. The first of which are objectives. You have the crysknife, the desert mouse, the ornithopter, and these are the ones that have little symbols that you're trying to collect into pairs. At the start of the game, each player is given a symbol. For a 4-player game, for example, there's 2 desert mouses and 2 crysknives. And the reason why these objectives exist is that each individual conflict should have some deeper level. For example, 2 players with the desert mouse objective will be more likely to engage each other in that conflict. On the other hand, players with other objective cards might want to stop other players from collecting that pair, as each pair is worth a point. That's the more subtle mechanic, I would say, but it is meaningful because each individual conflict does have a prolonged impact on the rest of the game, because each pair of symbols does result in a victory point. In a game with such tight scores, each half point, each match and symbol gives the potential to overtake other players in a clever and more engaging way. The big selling point, though, the one that everyone talks about, are these sandworms. And thankfully, there's both the wooden tokens and a more deluxe plastic token that can be painted. Both function exactly the same, but the idea is throughout the game you can gather the maker hooks to actually activate and use the sandworms. Sandworms are more powerful than regular troops with 3 strength, but the key reward is that whatever conflict rewards you receive are doubled, no matter if you win or come in 2nd or 3rd place within the conflict. This gives massive potential for swings, but also encourages other players to make sure that if there is a sandworm in the combat, that you aren't receiving 2, 3, 4, even more victory points by playing that sandworm. That said, the sandworms are a bit of work to actually gain and collect. You need to gain friendship with the Fremen, as well as go to Siege Tabur to gain the hooks, to eventually summon sandworms by going to one of the 2 spaces or playing cards. Overall, combat is a larger focus in Uprising relative to Dune. There's a greater emphasis on the rewards, not only of yourself, but of other players. Each objective card pair really does impact the general flow, because you can tell when people are starting to collect these objective cards through each victory that they're slowly gaining momentum and having more possible pathways to reaching the 10 points. Along with that, the sandworms themselves are a massive potential for swings, and as soon as you see someone building up to it, you need to be prepared to deal with the actual consequences. Otherwise, they'll steamroll through each round and make their way to the very end. Of course, there is the aspect of actually blowing up the shield wall. That's almost kind of like a game of hot potato of who's going to do it, as each player with sandworms will eventually want to blow up the shield wall. But it does either take a resource, such as an intrigue, or a player's turn to actually commit to do it. Overall, the standoff approach to each round of conflicts does increase the general tension of each game. And since each round is capped off by a conflict, it makes sense to really emphasize and focus on them as the peaks of the game. There's great memories when it comes to secrets and intrigues at the very end that completely reframe the upcoming rounds. When a sandworm is in play and those rewards are given out, it results in a meaningful change of what the board state is. Conflicts are always tense and fun, and really are a culmination of all the decisions that have been made in the round as well as rounds prior. For this reason, I think the direction of the game of actually increasing the emphasis on conflicts is intelligent. It makes sense. It makes sense to put extra emphasis on the key moments, the moments that people will leave and remember when they pull off a great combat, when they receive a ton of rewards. It does create meaningful experiences to all the players involved. Now, of course, there's all the new stuff. There's the objective cards, the sandworms, the Choam module, the Spies. But when we look at the core of the game, when we look at the actual meat and bones, one of the key modifications that they've done is through the Imperium deck. It should be mentioned that the starting deck is exactly the same as the original Dune Imperium. But the actual Imperium deck, the one you'll purchase through each round, this one is completely rebalanced and remodified. There's some subtle changes. For example, the Spice Must Flow card, it's now a Space and Guild card, which then has chemistry with other cards where you need to discard a Space and Guild card, which all have been perfectly fine-tuned in a way that creates a more engaging and interesting deck that can be built. cards on average have a higher payoff but also a larger cost, as well as the reduction of faction access is now mitigated by the new spy mechanic. Some cards may be overtuned a bit, but I think in general this is a much stronger deck than the one that was previously made for Dune Imperium. Just another example is that the standard card that can be always purchased in previous game, it was the Arrakis Liaison. It is now the Prepare the Way, one of the Bene Gesserit cards. And to show the level of thought and kind of the refresh that has been put in place, this card actually interacts with the board because you need to have your friendship with the Bene Gesserit to activate the ability of this card. Overall, the deck feels more balanced, it feels tighter, and it feels like each purchase matters more. Now, there even seems to be more card draw throughout the game, as well as the ability to recycle and trash cards quicker, and I think deck building as a whole is a much more viable strategy than the original Dune Imperium. And it's in a way that's more natural than Rise of Ix with Immortality. And I hate to say it, but Immortality, while it did increase the deck building, it created other problems. Dune Imperium UPRISING, though, doesn't have those problems. And I'll definitely talk about it more, but truly it's about the experimentation cards that kind of skew the boards more to yellow spaces. Along with the completely revamped Imperium deck, there's also the aspect of the leader cards. Total of 9 brand new ones, but all of the originals from the first game and most of the other ones from Rise of Ix, if you do some fiddling around, are perfectly compatible with Uprising. That said, the 9 brand new original ones are all quite creative and interesting, and I do think some of the easier to play characters are actually excellent introductions to the game, more so than the original game. For example, Gurney Halleck encourages that constant conflict, but it does reward after 6 strength. And that reward is about the deck building aspect of the game. So it creates a very interesting dynamic where a new player will understand that they should be involved in each conflict, and the reward for that is to build a better deck. Gurney Halleck is just one example. For example, Muad'Dib, the new Paul character, really emphasizes creating a strong Sandworm machine where you get to top deck an intrigue. Intrigues are super fun, and Sandworms are fun, so Muad'Dib enables for a very enjoyable playstyle even for a new player. On the other hand, more complex characters still exist, but there are some fan favorites that I will be adding on. For example, the Baron. Everyone loves the Baron. There's lots of room for influence-focused leaders, such as Daddy Leto, or the very well-deserved hated Tessia, as well as the more combat-oriented ones like the Beast, or even potentially Prince Romber if you decide to use Rise of Ix. All of these leaders seem to bring something new to the table whenever we do the playtest for them, and I think that they do integrate well enough that they can be ported over. The only leader that feels a little bit out of place would be Helena, and the reason for that is the spy mechanic is so much fun, so purposely disengaging with that through her passive does feel like a little bit of a miss. That said, of course, she can focus on placing spies on the faction areas, for example, but it doesn't feel as satisfying as just using another leader and fully engaging with the spy mechanics. That said, I'm sure in the next couple months, once there's a better understanding of the core mechanics and the relationship between this game and the other 2 expansions, there will be some kind of understanding of which leaders best acclimate within this system versus their previous games. But now we come to one of the most important questions of the night. What is the best version of Dune Imperium? Is it Uprising by itself? Is it with one of the expansions or both expansions? Is it with the entire deck list of the original game? All the expansions into one giga complex game with hundreds of cards, dozens of different characters, and many different mechanisms all put together. And I want to start off with each expansion individually. And we're going to start with Rise of Ix. Now, Rise of Ix can be pretty much ported over to Dune Imperium Uprising with little complication. But I do think there are some areas that you shouldn't bring over. Infiltration, the card mechanic, does not bode well with Rise of Ix. I think any card with infiltration removes the spies, and spies being such a strong aspect of Uprising, to negate that through infiltration, which was pretty weak of a mechanic, we shouldn't be diluting a good mechanic with a bad mechanic. Another consideration is that Ix actually will overtake a couple spaces of Uprising, and this does toss the balance a little bit off. I think that the new rebalanced shipping area that encourages the use of contracts is better than the shipping track. And I think Paul Dennen and the creators at Direwolf would agree with that, because players who use Rise of Ix actually have a special 10-card contract deck that's handed out to players ahead of time for them to get a head start on their contracts. Even with that though, the shipping track is notoriously difficult to balance, I feel. It's impossible to say as I'm just a sample of one, but I don't think the shipping track is as well thought out as the revamped Uprising shipping area. That said, Dreadnoughts are a welcome addition as a third unit in conflicts, and tech tiles, while they don't have any that interact with Sandworms or Spies or contracts, I think they're still a good idea overall. Overall, I would say that it's actually quite a different game when you play with Rise of Ix. I don't know if I like it better yet, but I do think it's worth a deeper dive and seeing the best way we could balance the Imperium deck to reflect Rise of Ix's unique quirks. On the other hand, I think Immortality is a mistake. Immortality as a whole really emphasizes that deck building aspect by encouraging people to get essentially free cards by experimentation, by using those Talaxu tanks, and getting new cards through that mechanism, ignoring the Imperium row. And like I mentioned earlier, I think deck building in Uprising has been buffed and is a viable method to play. The biggest complaint I have is those experimentation cards. By adding on those research icons, by taking away the units from Research Station, it does dramatically change the way that the game is played. There's always that necessary need to get those research icons off on your turn, and it kind of skews the balance of your starting hand in a way that feels messy and almost undesirable. While I don't have any problems with the Talaxu tanks and the cards that are provided, I think by implementing them, it doesn't add something substantial enough to counteract those critiques I have for the research icons. When it comes to the actual family atomics, that's a whole nother issue as well. I think family atomics were good for the original game because it allowed for us to remove those insanely overpowered cards like the Talaxu Master or Web of Powers, but I don't feel like it's entirely necessary for this game because having a stale Imperium row isn't inherently bad. It just means it's a different kind of game. That said, I think the family atomics, you can definitely make an argument for them, more so than you can with those research cards and the research icons. So what does this all mean? What is this relationship all about? And I think the question is, what's the best version of Dune Imperium Uprising? Or what's the best version of Dune Imperium as a whole? And I think when it comes to these expansions, it's clear that they were made to address issues within the original game. But Uprising doesn't share those same issues, and that's why these expansions do feel a little bit off, and they're not meant to be implemented one-to-one. No matter what, you're going to have to remove some of the content, some of the intrigues. You're not going to use the conflicts from the original game. You want to have a tailored version of this game. And I think when it comes to the best possible version, it does start with Uprising. Uprising is the better game than the original. And I would argue it's actually the better game than Immortality, Rise of Ix, and the original version. But I can't say for sure what the exact perfect recipe is for the best version of Uprising. I know Paul Dennen is going to release his deck list, his Frankenstein mix, but I don't want it right now. So if I could say anything in this video, it's don't release that mix yet. Let the community play through it. I want to play through it. I want to see what can be better incorporated. Where are my mistakes when I'm actually designing and thinking about the best version of Dune? I hope that the community will be able to experiment, and through thousands and thousands of samples, we're able to come to an agreement that Rise of Ix and Immortality, these are the cards we should use, this is the deck list, this is the actual way we should implement the game to make it work in the most fun and engaging and balanced way possible. The best version of Uprising right now, I think, is Uprising by itself. But once you start adding things on, I think you can make a better version through these expansions. Eventually, through Ix and Immortality, there will be a way to make a better version, but we're just not there yet. We need more people to play, we need more input. And with that input and follow-up discussion, I think an ultimate version will eventually come out of all the arguments. So after all of that, all of these points and thoughts and upgrades and modifications, where does everything fall into place? Starting with the original Dune Imperium, just the base game, I think it's about a 9 out of 10. It works great, it's a smooth, silky experience that's tight and tense, but I do think it gets a little stale and kind of has some funky issues. With Immortality and Rise of X put together, many of those issues are solved. There are some other ones, like those experimentation icons I mentioned, but overall, it's about a 9.5. It's an improved game, it's more varied, there's more leaders, there's more going on each game. With Uprising though, it's closer to about a 9.7. There's a lot of depth, there's a lot of nuance, and it's overall a more interesting and engaging game, even from Rise of X and Immortality. It avoids many of the pitfalls that the original game has, and also has the potential to be even something better. I think once you add on X and Immortality to Uprising though, the game qualities do seem to decrease. I would put it closer to about a 9.3. And the reason for this is X and Immortality were meant to solve issues within the base game. Uprising doesn't share those issues. Of course, like any game, Uprising does have issues, but I don't think the overlap between the original and Uprising's issues are very similar. From this perspective though, I think that eventually we will be able to implement X, potentially even Immortality, and create a deck list, a ban list, a draft order, something that works to make the game as equal, as balanced, as deep as possible. I disagree with those who just put everything all together and make one giant Imperial row with all the mechanics available to them. But I do think that might be a good starting point, because once we start from there, we can start to remove things, like I mentioned, those infiltration cards, potentially some leaders that just toss the balance into disarray, and eventually a new mix, a new ultimate version will come out, which will likely be better than 9.7. It might be a 9.8, 9.9, 10 out of 10, who knows, but it's just not there right now. In the next year or so, there might be an entirely different expansion which is exclusive for Uprising, and that might push the game to the next level. There's a lot of room for this franchise, and I think that Uprising brought it to a new direction, a fresh direction, and a direction that ultimately improves on the base, improves on Immortality and Rise of X, and has that potential to be something even greater. From this perspective, I highly recommend it. I think it's the best version of the game you can get right now, and if you haven't delved into either game, start with Uprising, and then go back if you really want to. I know my group, we're pretty much exclusively playing Uprising now, although we are experimenting with those expansions and seeing what works best. The only thing left I wanted to talk about is the single player, the 2-player, and the brand new 6-player experience. That said, I think that they're worthy of their own video, and I don't want to muddle the main message of this one. After a couple more playthroughs, especially of that 6-player version, I hope to come back and reevaluate that as well. Overall though, I think it's fun, it's thematic. It does feel a little less balanced than the 4-player version, but that's expected. It's more of a thematic, more of a team-based experience, more than a competitive format that the 4-player version presents. That said, keep it in mind, I am coming back to it. I haven't played it enough, and especially not with Rise of X and Immortality, to give it a proper examination and walk myself through all of the nuance of that 6-player mode. Especially considering there's multiple factions and multiple roles, I think it's important to play through all of that before I can give a truthful opinion. Anyways, that's it for me. I would love to hear your thoughts on Dune Imperium and Dune Uprising, and thank you so much.